Good evening and welcome. I'm Terry Sanchez. I'm part of the programming staff here, and on behalf of the Newport Beach Public Library, welcome to this evening's program featuring Dr. Himmet Dajee and Patrice Apodaca. Their book, A Boy Named Courage, tells of Dr. Dajee's remarkable story of growing up in South Africa during apartheid. As a non-white, he experienced firsthand the violence of bigotry and racism against him and his family. And through oppression and tragedy, he became determined to make a better life for himself. Dr. Dajee holds medical degrees from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and the University of London. He was an assistant professor at UCLA and a staff cardiac surgeon at Kaiser Permanente. After 2 decades in private practice in California, he retired from surgery in 2006. He currently serves as a medical director at a California healthcare organization that administers health insurance for low-income patients. He is a fellow of the American College of Surgeons, the Society of Thoracic Surgeons, and the American College of Chest Physicians. He has received numerous academic awards and has co-authored over 20 papers published in prestigious medical journals, and he is a frequent speaker at medical conferences. Patrice Apodaca is the writing talent that puts his story to pen and paper. They spent countless hours together as she carefully drew out his testimony and his voice and put a frame around it. Miss Apodaca is a veteran journalist. She's a former Los Angeles Times staff writer, and she is currently a featured columnist for the Daily Pilot. And before I turn it over to them, I have some exciting news to share with you. A Boy Named Courage they just recently found out that they were selected as a finalist for Best First Book in Nonfiction by the Independent Book Publishers Association, Ben Franklin Awards. So after this evening, they will go home and get a good night's sleep because they are getting on a plane to Chicago first thing in the morning to go to this award ceremony.
Wish us luck.
Yes. So good luck, and please join me in welcoming them to this evening's program.
Thank you so much, Terry. And thanks to the incredible staff here at the library. We're so lucky to have this wonderful resource in our community. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. We appreciate the support. So the question Himmet and I usually get is how we came up with the idea for this book, how it all came about. And the thing is, we've known each other for years. We both live here in Newport. Our kids went to the same schools. Himmet's wife is a very dear friend of mine, and it goes back to 2003, summer, and I was about to leave on a trip to South Africa. So I asked Himmet for some travel tips, and that conversation turned into a deeper conversation about Himmet's life story. And I learned so many things I didn't know about him before. About his family, about his life under apartheid, about his journey after he left South Africa. And I was riveted. It was a fascinating story. And at one point, I just said, gosh, Himmet, you should write your memoirs. And he kind of perked up and he said, gosh, I've always wanted to. And I don't know how. And so I just blurted out, oh, I'll help you. Like I knew what I was doing. But, I figured we can figure this out. And it was a lot harder than we thought, but it was great fun. We had a wonderful time. We kind of danced around for several months. I'd call him up, do you want to do this? Are we going to do it? He'd be like, yeah, let's do it. And finally, in the spring of 2014, we sat down in earnest and began working on it. It took us about 2 years to come up with a complete first draft, and then another year and a half after that to get a publishing deal. And so from start to finish till we actually were published, it was almost 4.5 years. But it was one of the most worthwhile projects I've ever worked on. And there were 2 reasons I was so passionate about it. The first being just that I recognized that Himmet just had an extraordinary story. As Terry said, he grew up a non-white in apartheid South Africa, treated as an outcast, not a full citizen in the country of his birth, not even treated as a full human, really, at times. And then in addition to that, he was the fourth son of Indian immigrants. Neither his parents had any formal education at all. His father was a shopkeeper. He sold shoes, repaired shoes for a living. Not much was expected of Himmet, but he wanted something better for himself. And through the sheer force of his own will, and with the loving help of his devoted older brothers, he managed to get an education. He moved abroad. He made a life for himself, and what a life. I mean, just a cardiac surgeon. That's reaching heights I can only imagine. But aside from that, there was another reason I wanted to tell this story, that I thought it was so compelling. In addition to it being extraordinary, I thought it was also very relatable. Just so many of the things that Himmet went through, his desire for a better life, his search for his own identity, his perseverance, his search for love and friendship and kinship and a home. These are universal struggles. And I felt a connection with what he went through and what he was feeling, and I thought other people would too. There's just, before I hand it over to Himmet, there's just one other thing I wanted to mention. Another question we get a lot is how we came up with the title. Well, as I was working with Himmet, I was always struck by how courageous I think he is. He never gave up, and he had so many setbacks and rejections, and he was told from an early age he wasn't worthy all the time. You're not good enough. And he never let that stop him. And the funny thing is, his name, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, his name actually means courage in his parents' native Gujarati language. And so it just seemed like that had to be the name of the book. There was no other name for it. It just wrote itself. And I can tell you, this man is nothing if not courage. Okay, with that, Himmet, if you would, can you talk to us about what it was like to grow up under apartheid, and then in particular, what it was like to be an Indian living in apartheid?
I think before I start, I'd like to thank Terry Stanley and Newport Beach Library for inviting us. And of course, Patrice particularly so, because she's really the one who instigated me to write this book. Although I always had this in the back of my mind that I wanted to write a book, but I didn't know how to cross that threshold. And fortuitously, we lived in the same community, same neighborhood. My parents, my wife and Patrice knew each other, and over time, we started talking about it primarily at a pizza place that we were at. And but anyway, your question was about living in South Africa or growing up in South Africa. As you know, that South Africa is a unique place. First of all, it was originally found by the Dutch East India Company, And what had happened was the British were there before them, sorry, not before them, but after that the British took over. But we came there from India, and the reason was because we were looking, my parents and grandparents were looking for better life. And when I was born prematurely, and of course no one expected me to survive. And but I grew up a scrawny guy in a family, fourth in a row of sons. And as you grow up, when I became more and more aware of this distinction, and I realized that why am I being shoved around and pushed around from different places? First of all, during the time of growing up, I had to endure going to different entrances into public places, for example, post office, libraries, taxis, buses, beaches. Could you imagine? You couldn't even swim in a beach, and you had to go to a non-white area, of course, which is really not the best selected ones for us. And I can name you endless other, discriminatory practices. The problem with South Africa, and particularly the Afrikaners, was they, although we were treated pretty badly, but I felt more so sad for the black population. And they were really treated extremely inhumanely. I'll give you some examples that I encountered from them. For example, if I was at a traffic light, and if I drove off rather speedily, and if the cop was next to you, he'd just drive fast and stop you and ask you why you're driving so fast. So they think that you are either, stealing something or running away from something. I remember I was walking from my dad's shoe store to my brother's shoe store. I was running. I was probably about 10 years old, and the cop stopped me. They said, "Why are you running?" So I said to myself, they think that because you are non-white and, you must have stolen something, that's why you're running away. And it was really so ridiculous. And then you realize as you're growing up, why is it that there is this remarkable maltreatment and also disregard for another fellow human being? Even walking in the street, if you walk on we call it pavement, on the side street, pardon? Sidewalk. See how easily I forget? On the sidewalk, of course, when you see Afrikaner or a white guy coming, they expect you to go in the street. They would not give you a way at all. They would not move away. They'll make sure that you will step off in the street. And it was really, but after time, this really gets to your nerves. And it's really dehumanizing. And I think that's really tragic. And that's why we find that we had a certain amount of subjugation of our liberties, and that's why we were not able to flourish from the economic, social, and political arena. And that's unfortunate. Although we lived in a mixed area, it was not segregated at this stage yet, but a lot of other communities were segregated, and ultimately, of course, we did move into a so-called Indian area only. The next section I want to touch on is about growing up in the Indian side of the family, which is, so we had to have a split personality. One, in the daytime, you go to a school which is English, and you mix with other people. They are not whites, by the way. The schools were for colored people, Malays, and Indians. And so we non-whites, we used to speak, of course, English was the main language, and Afrikaans. But as you're growing up, you have camaraderie and friendship with them. But guess what? When you come home, you're in a totally different world. And now you say to yourself, of course, and particularly my father, we were not allowed to speak English at home. We only had to speak our own Indian language. But yet he demanded and expected you to excel in English. So I said to myself, wow, how do you switch your brain instantly, from morning to the evening? And of course, the other thing too, when you grow up in the Indian community, I wasn't allowed to go to parties. No jeans. You're not supposed to wear jeans because that's a decadent fashion. You could not listen to rock and roll, and you could not listen to Elvis, because those are all decadent music. So so when you grow up, you say to yourself, "Hold on, which side do I belong?" So you end up becoming a guy with a split personality, and it's really it's in hindsight now I can laugh at this, but when we were growing up, you always realize there's a struggle and a tug and war with your father. And unfortunately, it results in a certain amount of tension and certain amount of, although you can understand, from his side, why he wants you to have the Indian identity so you don't lose your cultural background, but still, it's something that we as teenagers and growing up, we could never understand that. And of course, it wasn't me alone, my brothers too. We were all, belligerent about wanting to have our own identity, because we were in a world living at the time in a Western so-called society. So it was very difficult to navigate. So every day when you got up in the morning, we had to realize, strict rules, and you cannot swing to left, neither can you swing to right. So it was really a interesting navigation day in and day out, and it's just a remarkable experience to have.
We're going to show you a few photos, just so you get an idea of Himmet's family.
So this is my dad and my mom, and interesting,
This is their wedding photo, right? Yeah?
No, I don't think so. No, it's just a.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, it's just a photo of my parents, and so, in Indian society, in the old world, there was selection of marriage between at a very tender age and a young age, and I was told that they were actually selected in their teen years. And but they only got married, I think, at the age 13 of some, a very young age. But ultimately, they actually came to South Africa, and my mom was always ill, unfortunately, and she actually passed away at a very young age of 38 with asthma. And but ultimately, my brother told me that there was also possibly pancreatic cancer. My dad was different. On the other hand, he was very firm. Yeah. Yes, this is the front of the shop that my dad had, and you can see we used to have dry cleaning as well as selling shoes, and you can see bargain shoes. And of course, there's two sides. One side was ladies, and the other side was men's. And we used to have a great ball because we used to. We were asked to decorate, and we had these mannequins, so we used to fool around with them too. And but the shoe repairing was interesting because we used to work with cow hides, and don't forget, being a so-called Hindu, you're not supposed to be with cow hides, so that's why we were called mochi, M-O-C-H-I, and that means you're the lowest rung in the society. So we were really regarded as low caste. But to us, we didn't mind being called that because at least we were making a living. It doesn't matter what you do, as long as you're making a good living and you educate your children. That's what my father said, it doesn't really matter. But anyway, he expected all of us to follow the certain footsteps. One, to be honest, and also make sure that when you grow up, you marry Indian, but they want the choices, and then make sure at home you always speak Indian language, no English. And of course, as you know, that daytime we used to go to school, English school, And in the evenings, we used to go to Indian school. A bus used to pick us up, go to Indian school, and come back. So we had really a tough time. And then when you come home, by the way, I had to actually clean up, you know, when you repair shoes, all that leather particles and fine dust, it gathers along the shelves and on the floors, so we had to clean up. We had to wash the windows, clean the floors. So it was a pretty arduous work, but you know, that's part of life. And my father always wanted us to make sure that we work hard, because ultimately we want to make sure that we are self-sufficient. But he also wants to make sure that we always either take over his business or perhaps open your own business. And you know, so when we talk about, oh, I want to do some professional things like being a doctor or a lawyer, no, that's not in the card. So it was really, again, a challenge between the father and the children. And there was always a loggerhead, you know, so we were always, both of us were testing the grounds, you know. It's like tug and war. But it was very stressful, to be honest. And this was after we, after around about 47, so yeah.
Can you tell us which one is you?
Yeah, this one is a photograph of you on a boat going to India, and the extreme right was my oldest brother. The second one was Banu, the one who was killed in South Africa. The third one is my, the third son, and that is, he's still around, he's in Johannesburg, he's a pharmacist, and that's me, and that's my younger sister. That time it was the younger sister, and the last one was born in India. So while going to India, we actually slept on the deck. Of course, you know, because my parents couldn't afford, so they used to sleep on the deck. And it was cheaper, and taking a large family like this was pretty costly. So we went to India on that boat. Again, these are three of us, me on the left, Banu, the one who was killed, in the middle, and the pharmacist who's still around in Johannesburg. He's on my left-hand side.
And this is behind the shop, right?
Yeah, this is
They lived behind the
shop. We had a very small, how can I say, a yard behind the shop, and this is taken behind the shop. Pretty primitive, by the way. Now, this photograph is interesting because, as I said, my father always wanted us to make sure to be proficient in English, but at school only, not at home. But yet, we were reading the Life magazine. And interesting thing, I learned a lot about the world from the Life magazine, Time magazine, The Guardian, and we used to get the Cape Times and Cape Argus on a daily basis. But that was very important. That's me on the left-hand side here. That's Dheeraj, the pharmacist, in the middle. Banu, who was killed, on the other side. And if you look in the background, there's a couple of things interesting. There are two trophies there. And I used to play ping pong. And I actually won trophies. And I was very proud of it. But unfortunately, what had happened was we used to have a sports club called Table Tennis Club. Oh, Universal Table Tennis Club, and you know, it was primarily for Indians only. But one of my friends, who was so-called colored or mulatto, he wanted to join the club, so I invited him. And of course, all the other Indian members, they said no. Said this is only for Indians. So I said, wow, that's interesting. I said, yeah, we are trying to fight apartheid, but yet I see we are just as racist as the Afrikaners, you know. I said, what's that kind of deal? So anyway, I rebelled and I gave the trophies back and I said, I'm resigning from the club. So I know I stood my ground because I really felt offended, and so it was a very interesting experience I had. This is my brother who was killed. He actually opened up his own business, and he actually learned being a chef and a restaurateur by volunteering at a local Italian restaurant in Cape Town. And he opened up his own business, and here he is in the restaurant. We took some photographs, and you can see there's a chicken there, and he's ready to carve. And we used to have great fun in that restaurant, because I used to help him in the restaurant as well when I had about 2 years of period when I couldn't get into university.
And he supported you when you went.
Oh, that's the other thing. I'm glad you reminded me. This book is really in his memory, and because he and we used to have many a night of discussion on how to get out of South Africa, and we connived our way and thought our way, how can we get out? And he was very entrepreneurial, there is no doubt, and because he himself was frustrated and was really desperate to get out, and but ultimately he financed me as well initially. And of course, this guy, this is when I was practicing, and I have an artificial valve, a heart valve, in my hand. This was probably in my office, I think. Yeah, this was in my office. And so I had a great career. I cannot complain. And it was very exciting, and I think it's a very noble profession.
We just wanted to show there was a happy ending to all that. So. I had one editor who read our book. I remember she called me up. She got to the part where Himmet got to medical school, and she called me up. She said, "Oh, I was so relieved that he did okay." It's like, he's a cardiac surgeon, remember? He did okay, but she was in the moment. So, Himmet, can you talk about what the process of working on the memoir was like for you? What kind of things did you discover about yourself? Were there any surprises? Was it difficult to dig up sometimes painful memories?
As I grew up in Cape Town, one of the interesting things was, because you are bombarded on a daily basis with insults and abusive behavior from the government, you tend to bury all those memories deep in your recesses. And of course, not being able to get my proper education, I always had resented and had resentful memories about it. So I buried it in my recesses. And my idea of living was primarily, one is to look forward, never look back. So what I made conscious effort of burying these previous experiences. So when I met Patrice, and she started asking me questions about my memories, about all these things from South Africa, and I tell you, she was like a psychoanalyst. I mean, she peeled away at the onion, and it was just remarkable. And it's amazing how much information you can bury, and how much time it takes you to extract that information. It doesn't happen in one session, and it takes multiple months before she got most of the information out. And I actually even went out back to South Africa just to get some stories from my friends and my relatives and my brother, and it was worthwhile effort. But so that's something that I really appreciate. It's like it's cathartic to relive this whole area. And of course it was emotional, primarily when she started asking me about my brother who was killed, and what kind of relationship I had with him, how we grew up, and that was extremely painful. And living in South Africa in itself is painful enough, but to have someone killed, without any reason, is even more emotionally draining and exasperating.
Well, we were fortunate that you had kept such good records, too. He had kept all his passports, and at one point he wanted to burn all his old South African passports, but he told himself, I better hang on to this. So we went through and we saw all the stamps and everything, all the places you'd been, so we were able to date them. You kept all your school records, all your awards. We went through everything, bit by bit, right?
Yeah, you're right. You know, interesting thing you mentioned about, I wasn't a hoarder, but because I have a habit of throwing things away. One of the things I used to do, it was really, I had this tremendous desire. Mandela was like my hero, and I kept all his articles, his photographs that came out in a newspaper, in a booklet. And when I left South Africa, you know, I didn't bring it with me because I thought, you know, my father and my family will keep it. But when I went back after, in 1974, I asked them about it, and nobody can find where it is. But that was one of my things I had. The other thing I also had was, you know, Robert Kennedy came to South Africa and gave a talk at most of the universities, but at Cape Town as well. And interesting, the talk he gave there was on a vinyl record. And again, that was an amazing thing to have. And when I went back, nobody could find it. So it was really disappointing, you know, from that aspect. These are really good, memorable articles to have.
Can you talk a little bit about how it felt to you and what effect it had on you when you did finally leave South Africa and you suddenly felt free?
You know, that's a good question. I've told you quite a few times that once it fascinated me when I got on a plane in Johannesburg, and when a plane took off, it's interesting, there was the sudden release of burden. That, you know, you don't feel that oppression anymore. And I was able to be, and when I arrived first in Frankfurt, in London, in Dublin, it's amazing. You suddenly feel free. I was able to talk, you know, to anybody who I wanted to talk to. There was no segregation, and I really found very enlightening. And it's remarkable that when you travel overseas, and particularly in places where you have this opportunity to express yourself, and you know, suddenly you feel unburdened from this tremendous obstacle in your life. And to me, that was the most remarkable feeling to have. And to me, that was a blessing which I really appreciate.
Can you also talk about how all of your life experiences have informed your work as a cardiac surgeon?
Yes, you know, cardiac surgery is an extremely noble profession. And, you know, I always think about my dad. He always said that be prompt. He was a very prompt person. So that's why when I operate, I was always prompt. I never delayed surgery, and I used to get upset if someone delayed the surgery for no reason. Also, I was very meticulous. I treated every patient as if I was operating on one of my family members. The other thing, too, never give up in the middle of a case. My dad said, if you start a project, okay, make sure you complete it. And that's something I always remembered. And that always stuck in my head. And so when I operated, my job was to make sure that the patient is safe. Even if it took me long, or if there's some complication, I'm going to, you know, make sure that the patient survives, even if it takes me extra 1 or 2 hours. So I went out of my way to make sure that I don't give up in the middle, and to make sure that, you know, patient survives, and treat them as if you're one of your family members. And I think that's a very important lesson I learned from my dad.
I remember you always told me also that it was very important to you to always look a patient straight in the eyes.
Yes, I always made sure that, first of all, when you talk to a patient, you want to make sure face-to-face communication is the best way to communicate, and look at the face, and you can see their body language will tell you a lot about the patient's behavior and also patient's relationship, ultimately even post-operatively. The other thing too is that patients are always asking questions. So I was always drawing for them about the surgery, what kind of surgery is going to be done. So I used to draw the heart and all the bypass grafts I was going to do. And they appreciate it because there's nothing more expressive and makes it more understanding when you draw something for them. Because, those are like visual images that you can show. And of course, those are in those early days, there were no handouts or booklets that you used to give. And so it was pretty nice thing to have that experience of drawing for the patient.
I have a bunch of notes. I'm taking notes and recording our interviews, and interspersed in my notes are a bunch of diagrams of hearts that Himmet did. So yeah, he did that. And it was funny because, we decided early on this book was not going to be about cardiac surgery, but we still had to write something about it because that's who he is. So I had to learn something, and he was always diagramming, and sometimes I didn't understand what he was talking about, and he'd say, yeah, I know, I have to talk to you like you're in 5th grade. I'm like, no, talk to me like I'm 5. I have not a clue what you're talking about. So he'd run to his study, and he'd come back with a bunch of models of hearts and valves and all kinds of things. So I got a crash course in cardiac surgery. But one of the things you always said is you were astonished that so many other physicians in North America, they don't really examine patients.
We had a surgeon in Dublin who always said, when all else fails, examine the patient. And I tell you, that is something that I always remembered when I practiced, because I tell you, when I was in training at UCLA, residents and interns, and also in Canada, I'll give you some examples where the resident or intern will tell you, this patient has pain in the upper quadrant of the abdomen. And of course, he said, he needs to go for gallbladder surgery. But when I examined the patient, it's a totally different finding. What the patient had was actually shingles. So obviously he never took the gown off. So I was really upset with him. I said, this is not good, There was another case where a patient had a hernia, and he thought the patient had appendicitis. And again, he did not examine the patient. And so you say to yourself, my God, this is North America. And I'd like to go back to my old places where I trained, and I found it rather astonishing that patients are not really examined in detail, and that's why I always remember that dictum.
I'll ask you one more thing, and then we'll open it up to questions. I'm wondering if you could talk about what the reaction to the book has been among family and friends, both here and in South Africa as well.
Well, let me tell you, people were a little nervous because they thought I'm going to expose some of the secrets, dark, hidden secrets. And of course, don't forget, my dad remarried, and the stepmother, she was, I'm not sure. How many of you have good memories of stepmothers? But anyway, so we used to call her, so now you'll have to express my expression, okay? We used to call her the witch. So anyway, because she really treated my 2 sisters extremely badly. But would you believe it? Her daughter actually thanked me for the book, And she says, everything is right in there. She was absolutely, I was amazed. I thought she'll be one of the first one to say, I don't like this book, mention some bad things in it. No. And all my other friends and brother in Johannesburg all agreed that everything in the book was to the T. And so I was rather happy. I was, to be honestly, surprised. And but I did learn quite a few things from them, as I said, when I went back in 2015 while we were writing the book, just to refresh my memories and dig up some things which I may have forgotten. But it was interesting.
And the country
the
changed
country,
a lot.
yes, you're right. That's the interesting thing. When I left South Africa, I left with bitter memories, but every time I returned, I saw changes. And the last time I went, as I said, in 2015, I have to admit, if you haven't been to South Africa, you have to go there because Cape Town is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Secondly, if you can afford it, you have to go to a safari because that is something that, you'll once in a lifetime, that's all you need. But the country, it has changed dramatically. There is more freedom, no doubt. Unfortunately, a lot of corruption. And that's just a sad fact. But I think, even in this country, as you know, after the civil rights changed, it's taken several generations where there's better understanding between races. Same will happen in South Africa. It may take 3, 4, 5 generations.
Thank you both so much for being here. And again, good luck tomorrow as you attend the award ceremony. We will be rooting for you. Thank you all for being here. Books are available for purchase, and both the authors will be sticking around to sign them if you'd like that, right over here. So thank you again for being here.